Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're exploring the concept of decolonizing the university. What does it mean? Is it needed? And what, in practical terms, does it involve? Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. When we look back at the extraordinary year of 2020, one of the major themes, alongside, of course, COVID-19, will be Black Lives Matter. Large-scale protests began in Minneapolis in late May, following the killing of George Floyd, and rapidly spread across much of the world. In consequence, as shown through analysis, references to systemic racism grew 17-fold from 2019 to 2020. There were demands for reform of many institutions, practices, and habits of thought. Not least, there were calls to decolonize universities. But what does it mean to decolonize universities? Why is it said to be necessary? What are the counterarguments, and what should we make of them? And what does decolonizing universities mean in practice? Well, joining me here to discuss the subject are three of UCL's leading experts in the area. From our own Department of Political Science, Dr. Kathy Elliott is lecturer in teaching and qualitative methods in political science. Kathy's research engages extensively with post-colonial and decolonial theories, and she's been teaching on the subject of decolonizing the university as part of our undergraduate program this term. Subhadra Das is curator of UCL's science collections, working particularly in UCL's pathology collections and the Galton collection. She has done a great deal of work in thinking on UCL's past activities in the area of eugenics and on how UCL today should relate to its past. And Caroline Bressi is reader in cultural and historical geography in the UCL Department of Geography. Caroline has written extensively about the geographies of race, racism, and empire, particularly about Black presence in Victorian London. She was also a member of the Commission of Inquiry into the History of Eugenics at UCL, which reported in February of this year and made a series of recommendations around the curriculum, renaming of buildings, and other issues. Let's get started. Caroline, I'm going to come to you first. What does decolonizing the university mean?
That's a big question and probably has as many answers, at least as sort of many answers as us sitting around this table and many answers beyond that. I think in the particular context, perhaps that's been framed at UCL is a demand for a greater diversity in the voices that are taught to students, a greater diversity in who teaches that material, and rethinking and a reconstituting of the institutional structures of the university, who gets to come, who accesses those spaces, who accesses the materials that are available within the university. But I think those discussions are different in different places. Some of our departments are much more diverse than others. Diversity obviously means different things. There's a diversity in ethnicity, there's a diversity in gender. How do those come together in that great term intersectionality? But there's also critical reflections. Decolonization, is that really what we're talking about when you sort of think about UCL and the way it's rooted in colonial histories and colonial politics? Perhaps we sort of thinking about anti-colonial policies or something that makes us think about that this is a process that is not easy, and that's how we engage with that is going to be something that's probably long-term and difficult to face.
Thanks, Caroline. You mentioned the kind of diversity around the understanding of decolonizing the university. Subhadra, what does it mean to you, decolonizing the university?
So I completely agree with Caroline that there are multiple definitions, as many definitions as probably there are people. I want to build on the things that she was saying. So for me, decolonizing is predominantly about acknowledging the colonial frame. That is both the context of the university and also the context of a lot of our ideas, be they scientific ideas or be they cultural ideas. The quote that I usually come to comes from Frantz Fanon, writing in 1956, where he says, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot which we must clinically detect and remove from our land and from our minds as well." So the overarching idea of decoloniality is acknowledging the colonial frame of our knowledge, and thinking very critically about where those ideas come from. And I would agree that part of the solution is increasing diversity in terms of representation, but also representation of ideas.
Kathy, what is it about universities that are colonial? Could you make clear for our listeners what we mean when we say that the university is colonial?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this really famous paper by Tuck and Yang where they say decolonisation is not a metaphor. Decolonisation is about giving indigenous land back. And Gurminder Bambara, I think, really nicely talks about how that relates to the university, where we aren't in a settler colonial context, we're in the kind of colonial metropole. She talks about the ways in which universities aren't this ivory tower. They're central to politics and political life. And during the height of British colonialism, universities were involved in producing the knowledge that made colonialism possible. So that included the theories and ideas that justified colonialism, the technical and scientific knowledge that enabled the subjugation of large populations, understandings of how to govern large and unfamiliar populations, and so on. So I think when people talk about decolonising the university, not in a metaphorical sense, they're talking about making those things visible, making those histories visible, not pretending it doesn't exist, but rather showing how it still lives in the university, as it undoubtedly does. Some people talk about the importance of dismantling the ideas that still live on despite the end of formal colonisation.
Thank you. Kathy, you mentioned then history and how this plays out in history. So let's explore past and present of UCL history. So Padre, you've looked at the history of eugenics at UCL. Could you say first what eugenics is and what was UCL's role in it?
So again, here is a question where the answer probably varies depending on who you're going to ask. Eugenics means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I define it as the scientific study of human characteristics designed to inform state intervention with regard to improving the race. Hopefully people can hear the air quotes around the word race. The word was coined by Francis Galton, a Victorian scientist, who was a racist and a colonialist, and those ideas both informed and shaped his scientific research and was foundational to many contemporary sciences like genetics, statistics, psychology, and sociology. Through his collaborative work with two UCL professors, Carl Pearson and Walter Raphael Weldon, Galton is credited with establishing the school of thought that is called biometrics, which used detailed measurements and statistics to study biology. So in 1904, Galton funded the establishment of the world's first ever eugenics records office at University College. In 1907, this was established permanently and named for him as the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics. And when he died in 1911, he left money in his will to fund the world's first professorship in eugenics, which was a role that was taken on by Carl Pearson. So Pearson himself was an ardent eugenicist and also established eugenics as a taught subject, along with getting on for 2 decades worth of research and publishing 2 journals out of the university. So through this work and the association with Galton, UCL played a pivotal role in establishing and legitimizing the value of eugenics as a science.
So Padre, you work a lot with UCL's Galton collection, and you've just been talking about Galton's historical role in UCL. What is that collection, and what concerns are there in relation to it?
Okay, so this is an easier question. I think the Galton collection probably really more accurately should be called the Eugenics Collection. So it's a museum collection built around objects relating to the life and work of Francis Galton, but it also contains objects and paper archives relating to the early days of the UCL Eugenics Department that was run by Carl Pearson. So for the last 8 years that I've been curator, what I've tried to do is address the wider value of Galton and eugenics, and the collection is really an invaluable resource. So the objects in that museum collection bear witness to this history, and they give testimony to it. In terms of what the concerns are, you probably are better off asking someone who has some concerns about them. But I think the main concern kind of relates to the name and to the commemoration. So the fact that in the past UCL has had rooms and lecture theatres named after Galton and Pearson, it still has a museum named after Flinders Petrie, who worked with them both. Then that these men, they're celebrated for their groundbreaking scientific research, but there hasn't, to date, I think, really been enough critical consideration of their ideas and where those ideas came from.
That leads us really well into the next question that I wanted to pose to Caroline and to Kathy. I mean, in your view, what should UCL be doing about these matters? How should it relate to its past in these areas? And so Subhadra mentioned the kind of buildings that have been named around Galton and Petrie at UCL. Caroline, what do we do now as UCL to reconcile with this past?
Well, it's a process which has begun. So there was a series of recommendations that came out of the report into the inquiry of the history of eugenics at UCL. And among those recommendations was a suggestion to change names. Some of those name changes have happened. So I used to work in the Pearson building. It's now the Northwest Wing. The Galton Lecture Theatre has gone, but as Subhadra says, others remain. There were two sets of recommendations. We can go into the complexities of why that was, maybe, but in one set of those recommendations was a suggestion that all the names at UCL are put under review, and we think about the symbolic representations in all the sort of names of buildings or major buildings and spaces. The expectation might be that some of them stay the same, but some of them might not. And I think that was a reflection of thinking through the fact that, yes, there's been a lot of concern over many years, but the push from students, particularly over recent years, did get this inquiry put together. But there are other histories of UCL that we haven't yet really thought through and confronted. There were histories that we didn't even get a chance to touch on in the commission, particularly thinking about the histories of people who were critical of the racist politics and sort of ideas that were being put together and discussed on UCL's campus at the time. So it's part of a process, and the act of denaming, I would argue, is an important one, but it's not the end of the process. It's part of it. And there's a lot of work still to do to continue that.
Kathy, we're going to come to the curriculum in a minute as one of those processes or one of those activities. But I wanted to get your views on what UCL should be doing now, in addition to denaming and the inquiries around eugenics.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose when we're talking about colonialism and eugenics, right, we're talking about racism. And so what we need to think about is how do we combat racism today, given that that is the legacy of colonialism that we live with. And that might be racism in terms of how do students feel when they're here. So it's great that students of colour no longer have to sit and learn in the Galton Lecture Theatre, which is celebrating a man who did so much to promote scientific racism. But we still have all these subtle forms of racism around, to do with who has access, to do with how people are treated in classrooms, to do with microaggressions and so on. So I think the first step really is to talk about that, and that might start from a discussion of the history of UCL. I think that's a nice way of getting that conversation started. It might involve thinking about how we involve students more in the structures of the university, how the university is governed, and indeed what the curriculum looks like.
So, Kathy, I want to come to you now, because one of the big issues that we should focus on, arguably, is teaching and curriculum as a way of addressing both racism and decolonizing efforts. You've been focusing particularly around decolonizing the curriculum. What has your research found?
Right, so my research was, it was a project with students, and I suppose it was more precisely about diversity than decolonisation, although it's relevant to decolonisation in that the reason that certain voices and ideas have been marginalised is a consequence of those colonial histories. And so what we did was we used content analysis, and we coded reading lists. So we looked at all the required readings on core modules in our department, political science, at both postgraduate and undergraduate level. We looked at all core modules and a random sample of optional modules. And our findings were, in line with other politics departments that have done this sort of study, that around 71% of our readings are by white men, 22% are by white women, 5% are by men of colour, and 2% are by women of colour. So as part of the move to decolonising the curriculum, I think many staff and students want to see that representation of marginalised scholars improve. We also looked at how well the full range of ideas in our discipline is represented on the curriculum, So we did that because we just don't think it's a coincidence that students of colour are interested in post-colonial and decolonial theory or critical race theory or ideas which take the racialization and gendering of bodies as a process that we need to investigate, rather than looking at those race and gender as static variables that you can measure and so on. And so we looked at how well those ideas are represented on the curriculum. And again, even by our reasonably generous measure, we found that fewer than 17% of required readings take those ideas on and present them to students. And again, that tended to be in the optional modules, so modules on gender and so on. So that was what we found.
Thanks, Kathy. Subhadra, what would you add to that? I mean, Kathy talked about diversifying the curriculum as a step towards decolonising, but if we were to think about decolonising the curriculum, what, from your view, is work to be done?
I think the thing that I'd add to what's already been said so far is that it's important to realise that both the things like scientific racism and eugenics were actively part of the process whereby people were marginalised based on what was seen to be their perceived ability to contribute to improving the race. So one important group to mention there that we haven't yet is ability. Eugenics is racist to the core. It is also ableist to the core, applying to both physical and intellectual ability. So I think when it comes to decolonising, and again, important to point out, decolonisation is not a metaphor. The thing that we need to be thinking about in terms of an intellectual community at the university is who is invested with the power to create knowledge. Who gets to say what is not a thing to be known, or what is an appropriate method of study. And this is where, again, we need to acknowledge the colonial frame of the university. Those reading lists and those numbers, which continue to be shocking, even though they are not surprising, reflect the composition of staff at the university. So yes, diversity and decolonisation are not the same thing, but by improving genuine diversity, and the reason I say that is because you only need to look at the current Conservative government in power to understand that just because you are brown does not mean you are decolonising. To bring true diversity and true different viewpoints, but also giving them political power in terms of being able to say what does and does not constitute knowledge, I think is, again, might not be entirely decolonising, but certainly going toward the anti-colonial in terms of breaking the thing down.
Caroline, I want to come to you because we've heard about Kathy's research in political science at UCL. Does this apply equally to all disciplines? For example, what would it mean to decolonise the curriculum of physics or mathematics or even geography, your own discipline?
Well, I think we'd have to ask a mathematician or people in physics to talk about that. And one thing we did find in the inquiry, I think there was a gap of understanding between what we might think of as the so-called hard sciences and the humanities. And one thing I'd like to see UCL try and develop is spaces where we can have those conversations across the divide, because they were very difficult conversations. And although within the commission, I think we came close to being in a place where we could talk about those things and understand each other's points of view. There was a lot of talking and a lot of meetings to get to that point. And certainly in the public town hall meetings that we had, I don't think there was any sense that there was a resolution in those conversations. Geography is quite an interesting discipline in that we do have physical and sort of human sciences within the subject. We also have connections to Galton. He was given a gold medal by the Royal Geographical Society when he returned from his earliest expeditions to Africa, whereas Subhadra often says, he sort of brings forth many of his ideas from these sorts of field trips from his inhospitable place, as he describes them when he's awarded that medal. So, but geography is also a subject that doesn't have very strictly policed disciplinary boundaries. And so I have to say cultural studies and post-colonial thought has been influential in the subject for quite some time. And so I think critical reflections on place are something that's important. But that is not to say that, that reading lists don't reflect certain kinds of political enactments, even in my own in my own taught work. So I currently have a student on an independent study project who Kathy kindly shared some of the work that they did a bit earlier with us, and we've sort of taken that to look at one of the modules that I teach on, and the results are very similar. Even when I've tried quite hard to, I would say, to reflect critical work in the work that I've taught on cultural and historical geography, but it reflects a discipline that is not particularly diverse. Not many Black professors in geography. There are some, but not many. And so who's on the reading list to be a key person as part of a canon? Who gets to be, and the difference between those option modules and those key sort of reading lists are really important. So a long way to go, I think, in many disciplines.
Yeah, Kathy, you perked up there. You wanted to come back in on that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to build on what Caroline's saying, that we're all socialised into these curriculums, right? We all did our undergraduate degree and our master's degree, and we read these white syllabuses, and so then we create similar syllabuses for our students. So actually, for something to change, it's going to take a break in that cycle. And there's a brilliant book that it's just occurred to me as I was listening by Robert Vitalis, who talks about the influence of the Howard School and their international relations scholars in the United States in the 60s, and how foundational the work of these Black scholars was, including perhaps what would have been the first African-American tenured woman in the very beginnings of our discipline of IR. And their work is just forgotten, not cited, nobody knows about it. So actually just assigning that work would be such a step forward.
This takes us to criticisms that I want to address with my experts here today. There will be some people listening who have reservations about what's been said about diversifying, about decolonizing. So let's take some of those counter arguments or challenges. What would you say to those who might recognize that there are problems that need to be addressed, but would suggest that there's a danger in swinging too far the other way? So, Kathy, this was a little bit to what you were starting to speak out to. Some would point out that, Galton was, in addition to his work on eugenics, one of the greatest statisticians of all time. And doesn't he deserve to be recognized for that? So this starts to get us to a little bit about, a criticism of decolonizing and diversifying, but it's more about it's also potentially about how we balance academic contributions of people who also have racist backgrounds and beliefs and were racist in and of themselves. So Kathy, how do we respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back a bit on this swinging too far the other way thing, because there aren't two sides to racism, I don't think. But there is a kind of myth around decolonizing the curriculum, this idea that we want to erase history, or we want to pretend that these people didn't exist or they didn't do the work they did. And in fact, it's the contrary. I mean, we never talk more about Galton than when Subadra's in the classroom. And she talks about what he did, what he discovered, what he knew, what we learned from it, and then what the consequences of that knowledge has been. And some of those consequences have been quite dark. And if knowledge is anything, it has to be useful. And the uses to which it has been put have been quite dark, but very dark, in fact. And so I think that actually having the honest conversation about these people, in which we don't have heroes and villains, but rather we think seriously about who were they, what did they say, and what uses has their knowledge been put to, is just a more grown-up way of thinking about it.
Subhadra, could there be any merit to the view that people in the 19th or 20th century didn't know what differences might or might not exist in human populations, and it was a legitimate question to ask, and that the UCL research to that end helped show how previous assumptions about differences were baseless?
Well, again, this is me answering that question, and the short answer is no, because what these people were doing is not that they are victim to some kind of idea that exists in the ether and they fall into it, or they are stuck on it like some kind of flies on fly paper. People like Galton and other scientists who were working with him take existing ideas in science to do with race, and he goes about researching them further in order to be able to perpetuate the idea. So when I say Galton is a racist, that's not a casting aspersions on his moral character, although some people would want to probably do that too. What it's doing is it's saying that he is one of the people responsible for constructing our idea of what race means. And I think that this is an important part of, again, acknowledging the colonial structure of our existing knowledge. Really important to know that someone like Galton was racist in his outlook and colonialist in his ambitions, because the ways in which he frames and thinks about the differences between people as a science is built into that. And we are stuck with a legacy of those ideas still today. There are doctors who prescribe medication to Black patients purely on the fact that they are racialized as Black rather than to do with anything that is based on medical evidence. So I think, and also what that also doesn't do, and I'm sure Caroline will be able to speak to this more eloquently than I can, but this idea that everyone was racist back in the day is only really, again, giving credence to those particular people who had the political power to construct the knowledge that we consider to be knowledge now.
Caroline, let's come to you, and please feel free to pick up on Subhadra's point there. But I also want to put to you another criticism, which we often hear, is that some people say we should focus simply on the best research, and we should do that in a colorblind way, that we shouldn't take diversity or difference into account. How would you respond to that?
Well, I guess I don't even know what that means, really, to be honest, in the sense that I think, reflecting back on what Subhadra says, that, the idea that we can imagine that these political frameworks don't impact upon how research gets done in the first place is kind of ludicrous. Like, who gets to do research? Who comes to do PhDs? Where do they get to do them? Who gets to be PIs on research grants? I think there's such a sort of inbuilt arrogance in the assumption that I've got my my grants, whatever, purely based on merit. Is sort of depressing to have to still kind of argue in those kinds of frameworks, and I'm not sure that they're helpful in the way that I think people are sort of arguing in some ways at cross purposes. So with the arguments around sort of naming of spaces, the naming of a building after Pearson, although in the commission we weren't even sure if it was Carl or Egon Pearson that it was named after in the end. I mean, that sort of is kind of lost to historical knowledges and understanding. But that isn't, naming a building after him isn't a recording of fact. Of historical fact. It's a symbolic and commemorative act, and we can change our mind about the people that we want to commemorate and celebrate, and that doesn't change historical facts or whether we have no one's suggesting that people's contributions to maths should be denied if by acknowledging one part of their personality. But I think what Subhadra is trying to get at, the deeper, complicated, far more difficult thing to think about, is why would Galton and others ask the kind of questions that they were asking to create the kind of work that they wanted to create? Other people were asking other questions. The great civil rights activist in the United States, Frederick Douglass, a former slave, was asking different kinds of questions. W.E. Du Bois was asking different kinds of questions. And efforts put in to taking science in one direction didn't have to be put into that kind of material work. If instead of a professorship in eugenics, there'd been, a professorship even of sociology at UCL at that time, how might the university look differently now? And I think those are the kinds of, if we've got to, entertain counterfactual questions, perhaps those are the ones that are more interesting, at least for me, to ask.
Kathy, you want to come in on that? And I want to put a point to you specifically as well, Kathy, is decolonizing just simply not about reading white authors or authors whose views we disagree with?
Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to say, in terms of shouldn't we just be giving the best research for people to read? If we've got only 2% of readings by women of colour on our syllabus and only 22% by white women, do we think that's the result of women not doing good research, or do we think that's gatekeeping? Right, so that was just what I wanted to say in response to that. And in terms of, so I think sometimes in the media there's a bit of a moral panic about how people who want to decolonize the curriculum are trying to ban all the dead white philosophers that we like to read. And In fact, this drives me crazy because it's the contrary. We want to read them properly. We want to read them in context. So if John Stuart Mill, as well as being an important voice of liberalism, who we all read in the political science department, was a colonial administrator, which he was, then don't you think that that would be important for his work? Don't you think that that would impact on what he has to say, and therefore what we should read from it now? Surely it impacts on the structure of what we should learn from it. And so... I don't see anything wrong with having reading lists which are completely 100% people of colour in terms of just balancing it up a bit. But it's by no means the only sole goal of decolonising the curriculum. What we need is to talk honestly about colonialism.
We're almost out of time, but I want to give each one of you a chance, if I could get you to respond quickly. If you could do only one thing in order to help create a university that is truly inclusive, in the sense that we have discussed, what would it be? Kathy, let's start with you.
Oh, good. It's easy then. So yeah, I would decolonise all the reading lists. So I would make sure we have a wide variety of voices, ideas, topics, and ideas on reading lists.
Subhadra.
I'd fire all the white professors.
There goes my job then, I guess.
Sorry, I mean, I was about to say hashtag not all white professors. That's the short answer. The longer answer, I think, is something that we have talked about before. I really like this idea of conversations across the disciplinary divide, because I think particularly UCL prided itself on its science curriculum when it set itself up in the early 1820s. And this is something that I feel like that gap has just been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's the thing I'd quite like to do, or to be able to see, is scientists being better scientists by talking to historians, and historians and everyone else being better at what it is that they do by talking to scientists. I feel like, things got lost in the gap.
Excellent. Caroline, final word to you.
I think it's really hard because one of the things we're asking is for more and more. And we all know that is tough in the times in which we live. So I think somehow, I guess connected to what Subhadra says, that to find some space, to think about things, to have conversations, and to try and progress things. I think it's not going to be easy, and just an acknowledgement of that even would be a good first step.
Thank you to Subhadra, to Caroline, and to Kathy for joining me here today. It's really been a fantastic discussion, and I hope that it will stimulate a lot more thinking and discussion at UCL and in our own departments. Next time on UCL Uncovering Politics, we're looking at social contract theory, the theory that the principles governing a society should be principles that all could agree on if they were setting up a society together. It's a very old idea and has been dominant in political theory over the past half century, due in no small part to the work of John Rawls. But what exactly is social contract theory? What are its implications for how we should organize our societies today? And where are recent developments in social contract theory? Our colleague, Professor Albert Wheel, has just published a major book on the subject, and we will be discussing it with him. In the meantime, let me encourage you to subscribe to UCL Uncovering Politics. You can do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.